think your modern diet is questionable. Just wait until you hear about what medieval people were eating on a daily basis. These meals would have you sprinting back to your nearest fast food joint faster than a peasant fleeing the plague. We're diving into the most stomach-churning, absolutely revolting medieval meals that will make you grateful for every processed snack in your pantry. Let's start with breakfast, or what medieval people optimistically called their morning meal. Forget your Instagram-worthy avocado toast or even a simple bowl of cereal. Medieval breakfast was a bowl of something called brewis, which was essentially stale bread soaked in beer or ale. Yes, you heard that right. They were dunking yesterday's rock-hard bread into warm alcohol and calling it the most important meal of the day. The bread itself was often so moldy that it looked like a science experiment gone wrong. But hey, free penicillin, right? But brewis was a luxury compared to what poor families often ate. Many started their day with cold pottage left over from the night before. This was basically vegetable water that had been sitting out all night, developing a delightful film on top that they'd scrape off before eating. Imagine waking up to a bowl of pond scum and being told that's your energy for a 16-hour workday. Speaking of pottage, this deserves its own hall of fame in disgusting medieval cuisine. Picture the most boring soup you've ever had. Then make it 1,000 times worse. Pottage was made by throwing whatever wilted vegetables they could find into a pot with water and letting it simmer for hours. The same pot would be used day after day without proper cleaning, creating layers of flavors that would make a garbage disposal jealous. The worst part about pottage was what people discovered floating in it. Chunks of who knows what would bob to the surface. Sometimes it was a piece of turnip. Sometimes it was a dead mouse that had fallen in during the night. Medieval people developed an impressive ability to fish out the obviously inedible bits while pretending the rest was perfectly fine. Their food safety motto was basically, if it doesn't move when you poke it, it's probably okay to eat. Now, let's talk about medieval meat, and I use that term very loosely. Fresh meat was incredibly expensive, so most people ate meat that had been preserved through methods that would horrify modern health inspectors. They would hang meat in smoky rooms for weeks, letting it develop a protective coating of what can only be described as edible mold. The meat turned black and hard as leather and had to be soaked in water for hours before it could even be chewed. When medieval people did get their hands on fresh meat, it often wasn't very fresh at all. Without refrigeration, butchers would sell meat that had been sitting out for days in the summer heat. To mask the taste of rotting flesh, they'd coat it in every spice they could afford. Medieval spice merchants weren't selling flavor enhancers, they were selling smell masks. The stronger the spice, the more rotten meat you could hide underneath it. But the real nightmare was something called black pudding, which sounds innocent enough until you learn what's in it. This delightful sausage was made by collecting blood from slaughtered animals and mixing it with chunks of fat, oats, and whatever scraps of meat were too gross to use anywhere else. The whole mixture was stuffed into animal intestines that hadn't been properly cleaned. Medieval people also had a charming habit of eating every single part of an animal, and I mean everything. They made dishes from organs that modern people wouldn't even want to look at. There were recipes for eyeball stew, where sheep or pig eyes were boiled with herbs until they burst open like grotesque grapes. The texture was described as pleasantly chewy by medieval cookbooks, which really makes you wonder about their definition of pleasant. One particularly revolting dish was called humble pie, made from the heart, liver, lungs, and other internal organs of deer. These organs were chopped up, mixed with spices, and baked into what looked like a regular meat pie, but tasted like a veterinary nightmare. The phrase, eating humble pie, actually comes from this dish, because only poor people ate the gross organ parts, while the wealthy got the good meat. Medieval bakers created their own special brand of horror with their bread recipes. Since wheat was expensive, bakers would stretch their flour by adding sawdust, ground bones, chalk, and whatever else they could find that was white and powdery. Some unscrupulous bakers even added clay or plaster to make their bread heavier so they could charge more. Medieval bread wasn't just hard to digest, it was literally indigestible. The flour itself was ground using stone wheels that would chip off pieces of rock into the mixture. Medieval people developed incredibly strong jaw muscles, not from genetics, but from constantly chewing on what was essentially edible gravel. Dentists weren't needed because teeth would just wear down naturally from grinding against stone particles in every meal. But perhaps the most disturbing ingredient in medieval bread was something called ergot. This fungus grew on rye grain and contained compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages would unknowingly eat ergot-contaminated bread and experience mass hallucinations, burning sensations in their limbs, and sometimes death. Some historians believe that ergot poisoning contributed to witch trial hysteria, as entire communities would start seeing things that weren't there after eating their daily bread. Medieval fish dishes were their own category of revolting. Since fresh fish spoiled within hours, most fish was preserved by packing it in salt or drying it until it resembled leather. The result was fish that was so salty it would make your tongue shrivel up, or so dried out that it had to be soaked in water for days before it could be eaten. The soaking water would turn into a murky soup that people would sometimes drink as a bonus meal. For those living inland, fish would arrive weeks after being caught, transported in carts without any cooling. The smell would announce the fish cart's arrival from miles away. Medieval people developed a remarkable tolerance for the stench of rotting fish, considering it a minor inconvenience compared to having no protein at all. They'd scrape off the obviously rotten parts and eat the rest, often getting food poisoning that they attributed to bad air or evil spirits. Medieval dairy products were another source of culinary terror. Milk would sour within hours in warm weather, but people would drink it anyway, considering it a refreshing beverage. Cheese was made by letting milk rot in controlled conditions, often in caves where the walls were covered in mysterious molds that would add their own special flavors to the aging process. One popular medieval cheese was made by burying milk in the ground for months, letting earthworms and other soil creatures add their own contributions to the fermentation process. The resulting cheese was black, crumbly, and tasted like dirt mixed with sour milk. Medieval people considered this a delicacy, often saving it for special occasions when they wanted to impress guests with how sophisticated their palate was. The drinking situation wasn't much better than the food. Water was so contaminated that everyone, including small children, drank ale or beer as their primary beverage. This wasn't the strong alcohol we know today, but a weak, often sour brew that was safer than water simply because the brewing process killed some of the germs. Medieval children were basically functioning alcoholics by modern standards, consuming several pints of ale per day just to stay hydrated. Medieval spices were used not to enhance flavor, but to hide the taste of spoiled food. Pepper was literally worth its weight in silver because it could mask the taste of rotten meat so effectively. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and other exotic spices were prized not for their aromatic qualities, but for their ability to overwhelm the senses so completely that you couldn't taste whatever horror was lurking underneath. The wealthy had their own special category of disgusting foods that they ate to show off their status. Peacock was considered a delicacy, but it was served with all the feathers put back on after cooking, creating a dish that looked impressive but tasted like chewy cardboard. The meat was so tough that it had to be cooked for hours, turning it into something resembling flavored shoe leather. Swan was another status symbol food that was absolutely revolting to eat. The meat was greasy, fishy, and tough, but wealthy people would serve whole roasted swans at banquets to demonstrate their wealth and power. Guests would politely choke down pieces of swan while pretending to enjoy this symbol of prosperity, probably longing for a simple bowl of pottage instead. Medieval cooking methods added their own special touch to these already questionable ingredients. Most cooking was done over open fires that filled the food with smoke and ash. Pots were rarely cleaned properly, so each meal carried flavors from previous disasters. Medieval kitchens were smoky, greasy caves where food was more likely to be burned, undercooked, or contaminated than properly prepared. Food storage was another nightmare entirely. Without refrigeration, people had to get creative with preservation methods that often made the food worse than spoilage would have. Meat was packed in salt until it became jerky-like, then stored in barrels where rats and insects would add their own protein contributions. Vegetables were pickled in brine that would make your eyes water, creating preserved foods that were more like edible punishment than nutrition. Medieval people also had some truly bizarre ideas about food combinations. They would mix sweet and savory in ways that would make modern chefs weep. Imagine a stew made with beef, honey, raisins, and fish sauce, seasoned with cinnamon and black pepper. These weren't fusion cuisine experiments. They were desperate attempts to make terrible ingredients edible by covering them with every other flavor available. The social aspects of medieval dining were just as horrifying as the food itself. People shared bowls, cups, and eating utensils without any concept of hygiene. A single spoon would make its way around an entire table, collecting saliva, food particles, and whatever diseases the previous user might have been carrying. Medieval dinner parties were basically germ-sharing events with entertainment. Table manners included practices that would make modern people gag. It was considered polite to offer someone else food that you had already been chewing. Sharing pre-chewed food was seen as a sign of friendship and trust. Medieval people would literally pass around pieces of meat that had been in someone else's mouth, considering this the height of social courtesy. Even the wealthy couldn't escape the horror of medieval cuisine. Their elaborate banquets featured dishes like roasted songbirds, complete with tiny bones that had to be carefully picked around. They ate foods like lampreys, which are basically water vampires that attach themselves to fish and suck their blood. Medieval nobles would pay premium prices to eat these parasitic creatures, considering them the ultimate luxury. The preparation methods for wealthy foods were often more disgusting than the peasant versions. Rich people ate dishes where live birds were sewn into pies and would fly out when the crust was cut. After having been trapped inside a hot pastry for hours, they consumed elaborate jellied dishes made from ground-up animal hooves and bones, creating wobbly, translucent masses that looked more like science experiments than food. Medieval feast entertainment included watching people eat foods that were specifically chosen for their shock value. Wealthy hosts would serve dishes designed to horrify and impress their guests simultaneously. Whole roasted peacocks with their heads still attached, pies filled with live frogs, or jellied eels that still wiggled were all considered appropriate dinner entertainment. So the next time you complain about your cafeteria food or criticize a restaurant meal, remember that you're living in an age where food safety regulations exist. Refrigeration is standard, and nobody tries to serve you bread filled with sawdust and hallucination-inducing fungus. Medieval people would probably consider your worst meal to be a gourmet feast compared to their daily dining disasters. Modern humans wouldn't last a single day trying to stomach the revolting, dangerous, and downright horrifying meals that medieval people considered normal daily nutrition. We've been spoiled by food that's actually safe to eat, properly preserved, and doesn't require you to pick out the obvious contaminants before consuming it. Medieval meals weren't just disgusting, they were a daily game of digestive Russian roulette that somehow kept civilization functioning long enough for us to eventually invent proper cooking methods.